Thanks, Alicia. Howdy, folks. I thought that I would start out with a little bit of history to set the stage for talking about oyster farming on the Damariscotta River. And before I do, I had a little story I related to Alicia, because here we are at the Carpenter's boat shop, and so I thought I ought to have a boat story or a sailing story anyway. And I have this great book at home called the Nantucket Scrap Basket. And it's a book of anecdotes and folk tales and things of Nantucket Island. And there's a story about a Captain Stephen Bailey, who went to the church supper. New England church suppers historically did have oyster stew suppers. And Stephen Bailey, Captain Bailey, sat down at the church supper and he called the waitress over and he said, "See here, lass, can't you put a few more oysters in my bowl? These oysters are a day's sail apart." That's where I hear the laughter from the audience. We're missing that part tonight. So anyway, I do have a few other oyster anecdotes, but the oyster story on the Damariscotta River goes back a long ways. And depending on who you talk to or what you read about it, it goes back as far as maybe 2,500 years ago, when the native people who lived in the area at that time went up into Great Salt Bay and found an abundance of oysters and sat there and ate them and threw the shells into a pile. Actually, they threw them into many piles. And so the crazy part of this story is that beginning maybe 2,500, 2,000 years ago, the first native people ate oysters at Great Salt Bay and started piling shells. And they did that for a period of time, and nobody's sure exactly how long that was. And at some point, that shell pile became 3 or 4 inches of organic material on top of the shell pile, which represents every inch of organic material represented 100 years passing. So there were 100 years or 200 or 300 years of nobody eating oysters there. Piles sat idle, and along came another group of native people who we think are what we call the red paint people, and not much is known about them. Virtually nothing is known about the earliest group. The second group, the red paint people, are called that because they painted their faces with red ochre as a burial ritual. And not much is known about the red paint people either. They ate oysters, quite a few, and piled them on the same shell heaps that the earlier people had done. And then they moved on, or they stopped eating oysters. We don't know which. And another 2 or 3 inches of organic material accumulated on top of the shell heaps. Whereupon, after another 200 or 300 years, another native group of people came to the area and started to eat oysters again. And those are the people that we know as the Indians who are here when Europeans settled the area in the 1600s. So they're known as locally the Wabanaki Indians, part of the Wabanaki Confederation. And they ate oysters and piled the shells until about 300 years ago. So the shell piles were covered again with organic material, and trees and bushes grew on top of the piles. Some of the oysters in the shell heaps are the size of an oyster that you would expect. Some of them are a foot long. I've seen oyster shells from the shell heaps that are 18 inches long. And when you count the rings on the hinge, the oyster might be 25 or 30 years old at the time it was eaten by the native people. They probably cooked them to open them, because there are no metal tools in the shell heaps. There are stone tools. There are shreds of pottery. There's scallop shells, there's clam shells, quahog shells. There's bones of almost any animal that you would be known to be in this area. There's caribou bones, there's deer bones, mink, seal, skunk, rabbit, lynx, almost anything you would expect to see in this area. There are bones of those animals mixed in with the shell piles, but they're primarily oyster shells. And the archaeologists who have studied the shell piles have determined that there's anywhere from 1 million to 5 million cubic feet of oyster shell piled on the banks of the river. There's 5 major shell heaps. One of them is called the whaleback midden. And if they're not the largest shell middens, oyster shell middens in the world, they're close to being the largest pile of oyster shells. They commercially extracted oyster shells in the late 1800s to build roads, cook it for lime, for fertilizer. There were a couple of efforts in the late 1800s, 1880s and 1890s. And the last effort was done by a fellow named Holmes, I forget his first name, who the whole operation burned down. And that was the end of the program. He moved to Damascotta Mills and lived as a hermit until his death years later. One of the archaeologists said that if you filled 100 freight trains, 40 cars each, that would take away the piles. 100 freight trains, 40 cars each. Another person said that there was probably 3 million gallons of oysters. One estimate was 170 million oysters were piled on the bank of the river. Of course, the erosion washed away some of the pile. And now when you approach those piles, and there are trails, you can walk down to the shell heaps and look at the piles. There's a vertical cut along the side of the river, so you can see the vertical rise of the shell pile. The shell, as late as the 1800s, late 1800s, there were still native oysters in the river. There's a story that a fellow named Gilbert Gay went out in Great Salt Bay and he found enough oysters for the church supper, and that was in 1895. So you could still harvest oysters. The oysters went up into the bay as far as, for those of you who know the area, as far as Oyster Creek, and even Little Oyster Creek had native populations of oysters, and as far downriver probably as Cottage Point, which is about where our Pemmiquid farm is located. In the 1900s, they dredged the river for navigation because there were a lot of shipbuilders on the river, which enters into the oyster story because one of the factors that led to the demise of the native oyster beds was all the lumber yards and shipyards that milled lumber and then dumped sawdust into the river, and the sawdust smothered what was left of the oyster beds. So there were 32 shipyards on the Damascotta River, all the way up into Great Salt Bay and down the river a mile or two. There were also 20 brickyards on the river, and we have a piece of land where we keep some of the oyster gear, and there's scattered bricks all around the river. So there was a lot of industry on the river back in the day. People now talk about all the activity with oyster farms on the Damascotta River, but it was a going concern back the last 200 years. In 1887, there was a National Fisheries Report. They call it the Good Report, or Goody. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Goode. It was published in 1887, and the report said that there was some still oysters being extracted from the area, but not very many in Maine. But the report said that they believed that the first aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture, happened in Maine, where the Indians took oysters from the Damascotta River and brought them to the Sheepscot River and brought them to the Georges River, so both to the east and the westward of Damascotta, so they could have an oyster bed closer to where they might want to camp. And so the oysters died out probably the late 1800s, early 1900s, and in 1907, the Department of Seashore and Fisheries, which now we call it the Department of Marine Resources, but at that time, Seashore and Fisheries, decided that oysters would be a good thing for the coast of Maine. So they brought oysters to Maine and they planted them in the Saco River, the New Meadows River, the Sheepscot River, and the Damascotta River. And they put 10 bushels of oysters in 4 rivers, thinking that they would propagate. One of the problems was that as time went on, the Gulf Coast, the Gulf Stream had pulled away from the coast of Maine, so water actually got colder in the last 1,000 years along the Maine coast, and oysters need about 70 to 75 degrees to replicate in the environment, in the natural environment. So the oysters, the natural population died out both from the cold temperatures and probably from the pollution of the sawdust and so forth. So I don't think 10 bushels was enough to propagate a wild population in any of the estuaries. James Donahue was the head of the fisheries department, and he announced plans to plant oysters in every coastal county in the state of Maine, thinking that oysters would eventually be as popular in Maine as scallops and lobsters, which is coming to be true now, but it wasn't true in 1911. In the 1940s, the state decided in their infinite wisdom to bring in the Boulogne oyster. So that's what we call a Boulogne oyster from Boulogne, France. It's the European species, Austria edges, or sometimes called the flat oyster. They brought in oysters and they put them in 3 or 4 estuaries in Maine, including the Damariscotta River. They brought in oyster stocks from Holland, and I don't think they really took. There are some wild beds of Boulogne oysters, and maybe some of them are relics from that early planting in the 1940s. In the 1970s was when the first wave of oyster aquaculture came to Maine, and the idea was to plant Boulogne oysters, again, the European species. And the early farmers used lantern nets to grow the oysters, hung down in the water column. They had problems with disease. They had problems with winter kill because the Boulognes weren't used to the cold winter temperatures of the Maine coast. They had problems with biofouling, mostly sea squirts that settled on the lantern nets. And the Boulogne oysters, for those of you who haven't had one, I relate to tell people that take the coins out of your pocket and put them in your mouth and just savor them for a little while. And that's kind of what the Boulogne oyster tastes like. It's very strong, metallic mineral taste. Some people love them, but the Virginica oysters that came after the Boulognes on the Maine coast are much sweeter, milder flavor. So the 1970s, there were 3 or 4 companies that formed to grow oysters, mostly in the Damariscotta area, down in East Booth Bay and Blue Hill Bay. And they all pretty much either went out of business. They pretty much went out of business. One company continued. And in the 1980s, there was the second wave of shellfish aquaculture in Maine. And that's when I became involved with it. I have some friends, and some of the early oyster farmers in Damariscotta were graduate students at the University of Maine at the Darling Marine Center, and they studied with Herb Haidu, and Herb suggested that they try growing American oysters. And Bill Mook was part of that group, and Dick Klein and Carter Newell and Chris Davis, my partners in the Pemmican Oyster Company. We're all studying with Herb, and he encouraged them to try growing the native oyster, the Crestostrea virginica. And so in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, 1986, the Pemmican Oyster Company formed, Bill Mook's company a year before. And we all started growing American oysters, Crestostrea virginica. It took a few years as the water temperatures warmed up. We now have a native population of American oysters on the river. We started seeing them on the beaches probably in the early 2000s. Oyster farming, I sometimes say, is kind of like the microbrewery revival in America. So Maine has almost 125, 130, 40 microbreweries, and we also have about 150 oyster farms now. So there were in the late 1980s, there were 4 oyster farms in Maine, all 4 of them in the Damariscotta River. And now there are over 150 oyster farms up and down the coast. The Damariscotta River is unique in its ability to grow oysters, partly because, first of all, it's a 12 or 15, depending on where you're measuring, 12 or 15 miles from the ocean to the head of tide in Great Salt Bay, with lots of coves and mud flats. So that, and Great Salt Bay being a large saltwater bay, very, very shallow, is almost like a solar collector in the summertime. So as the water comes in with the tide over the mud flats, it heats up to 90 degrees or 100 degrees on a hot summer day. And that water then warms up the entire estuary, the upper estuary. So we now have about 15 oyster farms in the upper Damariscotta River. The reason being is that it's a large, 12 miles from the ocean, it's still a large body of water. So there's quite a lot of room. The water temperature is perfect for growing oysters. There's a huge amount of algae in the water. We call it pea soup in the summertime. It's a jade green color. In the upper river, you can see only about 8 to 12 inches through the water column when the algae is in full bloom. Some of it's sediment that gets resuspended and makes the turbidity higher, but a lot of it is just the phytoplankton, which is the food for the oysters. So we're almost up to the present day. We've had our ups and downs over the years. In the 1990s, we worked through a thing we called JOD, which stood for juvenile oyster disease, and we had oysters that would die every summer in late July, early August, and it was attributed to a bacteria, but we also kind of felt that it was a food problem in the river, that if there was a drought in late July, early August, and the oysters hadn't reached a size of, say, 20 millimeters, 15, 20 millimeters, they didn't have the strength to survive a crash in the phytoplankton, and they would die. We kind of worked our way through that, and that hasn't reared its ugly head again. But about 10, 15 years later, we were struck with MSX disease, which is not really a disease, it's a parasite that gets into an oyster. And it doesn't hurt us to eat the oyster, but it hurts the oyster. So the oysters began to die. One year we noticed a real die-off of oysters and decided that something was up. And we had a couple of theories, and one by one we dismissed each theory until we had the oysters tested and found out that we had MSX. And we've used broodstock that was developed in New Jersey to be resistant to MSX. For 20 years, we used to send oysters to the New Jersey lab to use as a control in their experiments to see if they were developing resistant strains, and they were. And so now we've bred their resistant strains into our main strain, and we have resistance to the MSX. So we haven't seen any problems with that now for over 10 years. I think I should talk a little bit about the oyster growing process. So that's a little history. Now we'll go into how do we grow an oyster. And they say oyster aquaculture, shellfish aquaculture is site specific. So if you look at aquaculture or shellfish aquaculture around the world, there's different growing techniques. Okay. Perfect. So there's different ways of growing oysters, but I'll talk a little bit about what we do in Damariscotta. And there's still a couple of differences between some of the farms. But the oysters begin in a hatchery. We don't collect wild seed, although we do have wild seed now in the river. And we've experimented a little bit with collecting seed, but it hasn't been very successful. So we rely on hatchery seed. We purchase seed from the hatcheries at different stages, but primarily when they're about 2 millimeters in size. So a gallon of oysters is about 1 million oysters at that stage, and they've been brought into the hatchery in the late winter, early spring, slowly warmed up to make them think that it's time to breed. They're fed, they get fat and happy, and they release their sperm and eggs. And in setting tanks, the sperm and eggs fertilize, the eggs get fertilized. They swim as larvae for 2 weeks, and they set on particles of oyster shell that are kept in trays floating in the tanks. And each oyster swims around as a larvae until it finds just the right particle to set on, and it cements itself to that particle. the particle being almost microscopic, 50 microns in size. And so very quickly, the oyster grows to a larger size than the particle that it's cemented to, at which point the hatchery can separate the oysters that have secured a particle to grow on from the particles that don't have oysters. They grow the oysters in the hatchery from that 50 micron or so size up to a 2 millimeter size or more. And then the oysters are brought to the farms. When we take our oysters from the hatchery, we put them in two different kinds of what we call upwellers. So we pump seawater out of the river at a marina where we have access to electricity to run the pumps. And we have two kinds of upwellers. One that we use for the really small oysters when they first come from the hatchery. We call it a bottle upweller. And they're tubes, acrylic tubes that are about 3 feet high, 4 inches in diameter. And we pump water from the river up through the tube. And the seed is almost suspended in the water. As the water runs up the tube, the oyster seed is in a fluidized bed. And they almost tumble in the tube, but they grow extremely fast. And so sometimes we have to, if it's a Friday afternoon, you have to check the tubes to make sure that by Monday morning, they haven't all grown right out of the top of the tube. So we're constantly grading the oysters in the tubes, changing the densities and moving them into more tubes until all the tubes are full. And at which point they go into a larger container in a different system that's also an upweller system. We pump water through a raft. It brings, when you pump the water out, it brings water in through the bottom of what we call a silo. It's a 2 by 2 foot square or 2 by 2 foot cubed fiberglass box. And we can grow the oysters in that box now with the water pumping through until it's a size of a fingernail. And each box can hold 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 oysters, depending on the size. When the oysters are about the size of a fingernail, we bring them to the farm site. Our farm site is about a mile downriver from the upwellers. And we grow them in floating cages. So remember now, they're still just filtering the phytoplankton from the water. The more water that passes past the oyster, the more food it can consume. And so in the upwellers, they have a constant flow. Once they get to the farm, they rely on the tide and the wind to move the water past the cages where the oysters are. And we put them in small mesh cages at first at a high density. As they grow, we grade them off and redeploy them in a larger mesh cage at a lower density. And the oysters will grow through the summer months into the fall until they're about a 50 millimeter size, 45 to 50 millimeters. And we bottom plant our oysters. Some of the farms keep the oysters in floating cages through their whole cycle. We take the oysters out of the cages in the fall and spread them on the bottom, and we literally broadcast them onto the bottom of the river. We mark the lease site with the buoys and run a boat up and down the site. We have a culling table on the stern of a 32-foot lobster style boat that the culling table is on a pivot, so you can dump 8,000 or more oysters onto the table, and 2 guys shake the table and the oysters slide into the water and hit the prop wash of the boat, and they kind of bounce around and settle to the bottom in about anywhere from 5 to 20 feet of water, depending on the tide. We have about a 10-foot average tide. And we let the oysters sit on the bottom for a year. And then we drag them back up. Some of our seed doesn't grow to the planting size by the late season, by November, December. So we take those smaller oysters and hold them in cages and bring them to an ice-free site and hold them till spring and then put them back out. So we're about ready to set the nursery back out with the seed that didn't get planted last year. So half of our seed got planted in the fall. The other half is waiting to go back to the nursery, and that'll be planted in July. Those will be really big. They'll be bigger than 50 millimeters in a lot of cases, but they'll be thin shells and not much cup to them. So they need to sit on the bottom in the colder water where they'll grow a little slower. The shell will harden up. The oyster will get a deeper, I gotta get my finger on the screen, a deeper cup. And we call them free range, like free range chicken. This is a free range oyster. There's no cage, there's no fence. They're just on their own. So there's a fair amount of predation, mostly from crabs. And we can lose as much as half of what we plant, but there's no labor involved. Once they're on the bottom, they're on their own, and we don't go to check on them until it's time to harvest them. So a year later, we drag them back up with a chain sweep drag that we have on a hydraulic winch on the stern of the boat. And we can harvest anywhere from, depending on which bed we're on and how many oysters are on the bed, we can harvest 6,000 to 10,000 oysters in a day or half a day's time. After we harvest our oysters from the bottom, we take them downriver about 8 miles to a place called Clark's Cove, which is the site of the first aquaculture lease in the state of Maine, 1973. Ed Myers had a mussel lease there. And we have rafts that are moored down at the cove, at Clark's Cove, and we can hold about 50,000 oysters in wet storage in the natural environment. In deeper water, the water there is 30 feet deep, 30 to 50 feet deep. It's saltier because it's only a few miles from the mouth of the river, so it's closer to the ocean where it gets more salinity. It has less turbidity. There's less sediment in the water, so it's much clearer to look into the water. It's still green. The oysters will still grow in the summer months, but they grow a little slower there. We don't leave them there long enough to grow. Typically, we just leave them there to kind of salt up and clean up a little bit. And we have a fresh inventory of seed of oysters ready to go to market. So on a market day, we can go out and pack the oysters into bags, rinse them again, and off they go. What else am I going to say now? I've gone through that process, haven't I? There's a lot of shellfish aquaculture gets a bad rap a lot of times, particularly in this country. The Chinese have been farming the sea for 3,000 years. It's a little newer of an operation here, and we operate not on our own farm. We lease our areas from the state of Maine. From all the subtidal waters are controlled by the state, and we grow all of the oysters in subtidal water. So we operate in an area that's a common use area. So we have to be mindful of the neighbors, the other uses of the river, transportation, recreation, sport fishing. There's a fellow who does a lot of guides sport fishermen in Damascata, mostly for striped bass in the summertime. And he came to me one day and he said, Smokey, he says, the trouble is that the best fishing is right underneath your nursery, right under those cages where you grow the oysters. And we get our lines tangled when we're casting out, and we get hung up on those bags, and it's just a nuisance. And that's the best place to fish. And I said, you know what, Captain Joe, the reason that's the best place to fish is because the cages are there. They provide habitat for the bait fish. They hide under the cages. They're in the hiding from the bigger fish. There's bugs and other biofouling that grow on the cages, and when we flip the cages, some of that stuff falls off and it feeds the bait fish, and the bait fish come in there like crazy. and that brings in the stripers. So the stripers are there because of the bait fish, and the bait fish are there because of the oyster cages. We've also noticed that where we bottom plant the oysters, it's kind of a muddy, but it's a hard bottom, and you think of aquaculture as being a monoculture, that we're only growing oysters, but because we've planted oysters in those beds, it attracts other animals. So there's actually more diversity in the area of the oyster farms because the oysters are there than there was before the oysters were put there. The oysters feed on the phytoplankton. They reduce the sediment and the turbidity. Oysters have a unique digestive tract. They filter the water, and they have two exit strategies for what they filter in. So the first exit strategy is for the detritus and sediment, mud that they suck in through the water. It kind of goes out the side door, and the nutrients, the phytoplankton, goes through their whole digestive tract and goes out another exit. So they not only take the mud out of the water and deposit it, they also take the nutrients out. So wherever there's development on the shore, there's an excess of nitrogen, and so the oysters and all the shellfish help to relieve the excess nutrient load in the water. How am I doing, ladies?
You're doing great. You get a couple more minutes.
All right, 6 more minutes. Oh, I wanted to talk a little bit about why oysters are so good for you, right? Which is kind of unusual because usually things that taste so good are not good for you, right? But oysters aren't that way. Oysters have all the essential vitamins and minerals. They have A, B, C, D, as high up as the alphabet goes with vitamin names. They have all the essential minerals. They're loaded with zinc, calcium, phosphorus, copper, iron. The zinc is the important one. The zinc is the one that gives oysters their aphrodisiac reputation. They also are high in fatty 3 omegas, so they're heart healthy. They're high in protein, low in calories, low in saturated fats. So there's nothing wrong with eating oysters. The more, the better. What else did I have in mind? Look at my notes here. That might be about all I had planned to talk about. I went right through that pretty fast, didn't I? Where to go to eat oysters? That's a good point, Kaylee. Thank you. Yeah, well, back about 5 or 10 years ago, they started what they call the Oyster Trail, the Maine Oyster Trail. So just like there's a wine trail in California and a brewery trail in Maine, there's now an oyster trail, and there are any number of places. But just in the Damascotta region, there's probably 10, 15 restaurants that serve oysters. A lot of the farms have their own little oyster tasting area, and we started one in Bristol a couple of years ago. So we run a place called the Oysteria, and it's a small outdoor restaurant where you can sample the oysters and some other delicacies of the sea and enjoy a beverage by the gardens. Glidden Point Oyster Farm has a outdoor tasting room. The Shuck Station in Newcastle serves all the oysters from the Damascotta River, so you can sample numerous kinds of oysters from the different farms and compare their flavors. In 2001, we started an oyster festival, and we've run that for 19 years until the pandemic came along. We halted that, and we're hoping to put that back together this year in maybe a different format the last Sunday of September, when the oysters are at their best in the fall. And the reason, I was speaking with somebody on the Zoom call before we started, oysters actually get sweeter and plumper in the fall. They grow in the summer months. They don't grow at all when the water is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So as the water warms up, the oysters will start feeding, and they'll grow all summer. And as the water cools down in the fall, they will slowly, they'll stop growing their shells and they'll plump up the meats inside. And they'll actually put on a sugar to help them survive through the dormant period in the winter. So they literally get sweeter and they get plumper, and they stay that way through the fall. So the best time to eat oysters are the months with R's: September, October, November, December. And as the winter goes on, they feed on their own reserves, and by spring they get a little thin. But we eat them all year. Should we take questions now?
Yeah. let's
All
do
right.
it.
Okay, folks, this is you guys, you often don't get myself and our speaker at once, so I'm just want to check in with you all and see if you have some questions. And we're going to take this opportunity, if you'd like, to put some questions in the chat box for Smokey. We have him for about 15 more minutes, so I'm going to classically ask the questions, and then Smokey is going to give us some great answers. All right. First question of the night is from a gentleman who you know, his name is Bobby Ives. And how much quicker does a cultured oyster grow rather than a wild one?
You know, I don't think there's necessarily, they don't necessarily grow any quicker as a cultivated oyster. The wild oysters that we see on the beaches, they mostly set in the wild. When the oysters spawn in Maine, it's mid to late July, generally, when the water's 70 to 75 degrees, and they set mostly on the intertidal zone. So they're where the water isn't always, they're not always feeding. So there's times, depending on how high up on the tide they are, they might not be feeding for a certain amount of the tide water. But they're spread out. They're not as crowded as they are in either surface cages or even in our beds where we plant them. They're more scattered, so they're not competing for food quite as much as the cultivated oysters. They seem to grow at about the same rate. And of course, they're eating the same phytoplankton that the cultivated oysters are growing. And I think they're primarily bred from the cultivated oysters. As I say, there were no wild oysters when
Where's your ball?
And so I would say they grow at about the same rate, and they taste very similar. They have a slightly different shell appearance.
So another question for you, Smokey. Are there any threats to oyster farming that we should be aware of?
Now we get a little political with the answer to that question. Because I mean, there are disease issues. I talked a little bit about the MSX and the juvenile oyster disease. We've had challenges over the years, but I think one of the biggest threats to oyster farming really is the perception that oyster farming isn't a good thing for the environment, or for the environment, I guess. We operate in an area that we have to share that area. We don't own the land that we farm on, so everybody has to be happy about it. And there's a perception that maybe there are too many oyster farms, that it becomes difficult to navigate through the cages, or that the oysters are sucking up all the phytoplankton and not leaving enough for the clams and the other bivalve filter feeders. From what we've studied so far and what we observe, the oysters, even in an area like the Damascotta River, where there's a concentration of farms, we're not coming anywhere near using the phytoplankton up. There's more. It's still pea green water in the summertime. So I think it's more of a perception, and as I said earlier, also the oyster farms are probably less intrusive than 34 shipyards and 20 brickyards and scows going up and down the river. The river was more of an industrial site 100 years ago than it is today.
Is red tide still a factor on the Central Coast?
Red tide is a factor. In the 34 or 35 years that I've been involved in the oyster business, we have never been closed for red tide. American oysters are less susceptible to high levels of the toxins of red tides than other bivalves. So mussels are very susceptible to red tide, as are European oysters, as are clams next, and whelks, and some of the different bivalves are taken off. They are put on the do not eat list at different levels of red tide. And there was one year that I came down to work one day and get out in the boat, and the water was red. And I thought, oh, this is it. This is red tide. What am I going to do? So I called the DMR, and they said, well, bring a sample down to the lab and we'll check it out. So I brought the sample down to West Boothbay, and we shucked out a couple dozen oysters and ground up the meats, put them in a needle, and we injected the meats into mice. And we had about 10 mice and 10 beakers on the counter, and we dropped a mouse into each beaker and set the timer for 10 minutes. And when the bell went off, all the mice were still swimming or running around the beaker. And the scientist said to me, looks like you're okay. So they have a new way of testing. There's a much more scientific method, but this was used for 30 or 40 years, and it was developed in Maine to check the toxin levels. A small dose of PSP, red tide, is called paralytic shellfish poisoning. So it'll give you a tingling in your fingertips, but it'll paralyze you and kill you if you get a large dose of it. So it's nothing to fool around with.
Smokey, will you speak to the ages of the oyster farmers? Like, is there a good mix of young and more experienced so as to keep the industry thriving?
Good question. There's a lot of young people involved. Like I say, there's now 150 oyster farms just in Maine. We've always thought that eventually the supply would meet the demand because there's so many farms coming along, but there are more people eating oysters all the time. But there's a lot of young people getting involved. We were young people when we started. So now we're the old guard, but that's what happens, right? There's a lot of young people getting into it, and there's a couple of internship programs, some of the farms, and we're hoping to have one this summer, an intern, a college student or a recent graduate who wants to get their feet wet, literally, and get their overalls dirty. So yeah, there's a good mix of we didn't have textbooks on how to do it when we started. We were kind of making things up as we went, but now there's also a little more literature about how to operate a farm. But there's a good mix of ages. And men and women, I should say.
Smokey, will you talk a little bit more about what a shell midden is?
What a midden is?
Yeah,
It's literally just the term given to a pile of shells. And when the archaeologists started to study the middens, it was obvious that the Indians didn't move the shells to those piles. They ate the oysters there and threw the shells into the pile, and they literally just tossed shell upon shell. And some of those middens, before they harvested them, and local people harvested them for years, the shells, to make road beds and trim out their gardens or what have you, hauled them off by horse cart and scow or whatever for many years. But in the late 1880s, they literally harvested them commercially. And some of those piles were 30 feet in depth, 300 feet along the riverbank, and 100 feet from the riverbank back in towards shore. So huge piles. But literally one oyster at a time was eaten and thrown into the pile.
so cool. Which is the larger aquaculture enterprise, oysters or mussels?
In Maine, I would say oysters. Probably by dollar value and also by volume. There's 150 oyster farms. Some of them are small 1-2 person operations. So they're not cranking out a huge amount, but and the mussel farms are generally larger. There's 2 ways of farming mussels in Maine. One is bottom culture, where they drag seed and then spread it in beds where they'll grow better than they would in the natural wild bed. The other method is to catch seed in the water column and then attach it to ropes that hang off of rafts. In Prince Edward Island, they have long lines with ropes, but we have eider ducks here, and eider ducks love mussels. So the farms that are rope cultured mussels, which are the better quality because they grow faster, they have a higher meat to shell ratio. They can put a lot of mussels on a 40 by 40 foot square raft and then put netting around the outside of the raft to keep the ducks from getting to the mussels. But mussel farming can be done in more places. You don't need the warm temperature that you do for oysters. So there's room for mussel culture to grow in Maine.
Cool. Will you share with us how much of an issue the crabs are?
Crabs are bad. When we started farming, we tried different things. We put crab traps out, thinking that we could eliminate the predation of the crabs. And so the question becomes, if you're baiting a trap and you're setting it by the oyster bed, are you attracting crabs to the oyster bed? You put the traps around the perimeter of the bed. You certainly don't put them in the middle, but if you put them around the perimeter, aren't you bringing crabs from outside the bed towards the bed? We put up fences early on around the beds, and that just collected seaweed and other biofouling. So it cut down on the flow of the water, and that wasn't a particularly good thing. But what's changed is the proliferation of green crabs along the coast of Maine, and that's also devastated the natural clam populations. So the green crabs are smaller than the native crabs, but they're more ferocious, and they're not, they have no commercial value right now. Chefs and there's efforts to try to find ways of using the green crabs so that people will collect them, and they've proliferated in some of the warmer winters that we've had in the last 10 to 20 years. So there seem to be more green crabs in the upper river now than the native crab, and the green crabs are more of a nuisance.
How many folks are employed at the Pemmican Oyster Company?
Okay, I have two partners in the Pemmican Oyster Farm, Carter Newell and Chris Davis. We were friends in college many years ago, and they are both now PhD. They're both Dr. Newell and Dr. Davis. They both studied oceanography and shellfish biology at the PhD level. I was a philosopher in college. So there's three of us that own the business, and right now we have 3 employees. I think we're going to have an intern for the summer. So
do you ever offer tours of your operation, maybe a multi-hour or a partial day?
I'm going to go back to that previous question just for a second. With 12, maybe 12 oyster farms on the river, a couple of years ago, we were talking about it amongst ourselves, and we figured there's at least 100 people working on the river in the oyster industry. And that's just farming the oysters. And then, of course, there's the multiplier effect of the restaurants that serve the oysters and so forth. So it's a good little industry in a small town. Do we ever offer tours? No, not as a general rule, because we're lucky in that our friends, Captain Chip Holmes and his partner, Olga Oros, purchased about 5 years ago a old Navy launch, and they totally retrofitted her. She's called the Oyster Tripper, the River Tripper, and they can hold 48 guests on board, and they do 2-hour tours of the Damariscotta River from the town landing down to Merry Island, which is about 4 or 5 miles downriver. And they do a 2-hour tour. They pass by most of the farms and they point out who's doing what and kind of slow down, and they say hello, and they take our picture when we're working on the boats or the rafts. And they have a bar on board. They serve wine and beer, and they serve oysters. So you can be on the boat eating oysters as you drive, as you motor past the oyster farms themselves. And you see the other sights of the river, the eagles flying by or the seals on the ledges. It's a great thing. Oh, we ran out of questions?
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
I see some familiar faces there.
Joe,
so-
do you have a question? Joe Gutentag?
Oh, he's muted.
Joe, you gotta unmute.
Mm,
Mm,
We can't unmute him, can we? He has to do it. So,
Joe, can you unmute yourself?
no,
No. Okay,
all right.
All right. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for being here. Smokey, thank you so much. We'll see you all next time. They're
Thank
clapping.
you.
Yes, yes.
The applause is deafening.
yes. Bye, you all. Thank you so much. Outstanding presentation.